Okay, let's talk potential future NHL expansion. Will the NHL eventually expand to a 40-team league? Now, this idea of a 40-team NHL league is not new. We can go back to the late 90s, early 2000s when the league expanded to 30 teams. There was an idea for a European division to bring the league up to 40 teams. There was an idea during the 90s expansion to have a European division, which is madness. But the NHL had multiple proposals on the table of future expansion, and a 40-team league was seen as a bit mental at the time. Now it's not looking so crazy, is it? Because during the Vegas expansion process, we do know that Houston and Quebec, for example, also put in bids to become the 31st franchise publicly. We know other cities were also in the running, but publicly, Houston and Quebec also raised their hands saying, we'll put it in an expansion bid. We know during the Seattle process, multiple cities put up and put in expansion bids, and many meetings were had between the NHL and a variety of locations in regards to potential future expansion. The league expands to Vegas and then to Seattle, and then last season we know what happened with Arizona and the Coyotes being relocated to Salt Lake City and the farce that became. But during that process, yet again, cities were having meetings with the NHL into regards of expansion or relocation. But let's have a look at some of the cities that have come up into the conversation in recent years, over the last decade, in regards to expansion and or relocation. Cincinnati comes up quite regularly. Now, from what I can gather, there may have been informal meetings with ownership groups from Cincinnati, but it's a location that regularly comes up on social media, on fan forums, for a potential location for future expansion. Ohio has several big metros. They already have a team in the Blue Jackets in Columbus. And so you could potentially have a rivalry with Columbus in the state of Ohio in regards to Cincinnati. It works well for time zone. It works well for potentially being an Eastern Conference team if you were to go there. Is it the wealthiest metro? No, but it does work for location. It is a sizable metro on the eastern side of the US. It's on a Great Lakes state, so it's not too far from the Canadian border. And you could automatically have a rivalry with, let's say, Detroit or Columbus worked in there because of its location. So it works well for time zone. It works well for travel for other teams, especially from the Eastern Conference. It just doesn't strike me as Ohio just doesn't strike me as a state that may support a second NHL franchise. The Blue Jackets aren't necessarily the most valuable franchise. They haven't been very, very successful, and at times they have struggled to draw fans. And there's been even calls at times to move the Blue Jackets because they haven't really had lengthy playoff runs or success in the regular season. But Cincinnati does regularly come up in conversation as a location that could potentially work for the NHL. Houston. Now, we do know that Houston has had multiple meetings over the last decade. Ownership groups from Houston have had multiple meetings with the NHL about potentially being an expansion location or a relocation location. During the Vegas expansion, there was an active bid from Houston to get a team. During Seattle, it was again mentioned in the conversation, although we knew Seattle was going to be given the team pretty much from the application process. And also during the Arizona relocation, Houston was very public in having meetings with the league about being either the next franchise in expansion or taking the Coyotes franchise on and keeping them in that area of the US. Ultimately, the Coyotes would end up in Utah, but Houston regularly comes up in conversation. Massive metro. You've got Dallas. Houston-Dallas would be a great rivalry. The Houston Aeros were quite successful in the WHA, so we do know that people will support hockey in that location. And meetings have been had. So it's looking very likely that if and when the NHL does go into expansion again, Houston will be a location that they look at. Atlanta regularly comes up in conversation, one of the biggest metros in the US that doesn't have an NHL franchise. The league has been twice before in Atlanta, however. The Flames and the Thrashers, both times the league has been forced to relocate teams to Canada The irony of that. So when they go to Atlanta, within a few years they end up relocating to Canada. But it's a massive metro. The NHL does believe that there's the potential there, and there have been two, or at least two, potentially three ownership groups that have had meetings from Atlanta with the NHL in regards to sorting out or going through the process of application to have an expansion franchise. Arena issues are potentially what could hold that back, although there are plans from two ownership groups in the same suburb of Atlanta to have a new arena built. I think they're quite serious about going back to Atlanta. It's a massive metro area, TV market, sponsorship, corporate. It makes sense, and fans are in Atlanta. Fans supported the Flames. Fans supported the Thrashers. The Atlanta Flames just weren't very good on the ice, and the Atlanta Thrashers, well, they didn't have a building post 2011. So the reasons with Atlanta moving to Winnipeg and Atlanta moving to Calgary, sort of similar in a sense to the Phoenix situation, Arizona situation we saw earlier, last year. Omaha, Nebraska is a bit left field, much smaller metro. Nebraska doesn't really strike people as a place where you would have Major League Hockey, but Omaha, Nebraska's had meetings in the last 12 months with the league about the potential of getting an NHL franchise at some point. Smaller metro than the other metros that we've mentioned. I think it's the second smallest metro on the list that I have. But there has been interest from Omaha. During the Arizona relocation process, Omaha said, we'll have a team. Bit surprising as the metro in Omaha is less than 1 million people, but has the NHL conquered the Midwest? I don't think. I think there's a big gap in the US where the NHL hasn't necessarily got a footprint. In the US geographically, Nebraska is one of those. It's one of those flyover states, and the Midwest is not really known for its major league franchises. A few exceptions of cities and locations where there are very successful franchises, but Omaha, Nebraska doesn't really strike me as a location. But there's some small market Canadian and US teams that do reasonably well in the NHL, which have similar populations to Omaha. It's possible it could work. New Orleans most recently has come out with interest for the NHL. Meetings have been had in New Orleans, and the state governor is very keen to get the NHL in Louisiana. So that's an interesting one. The only professional hockey that New Orleans has had is the ECHL between 97 and 2001, 2002. But the interest is there. Is New Orleans a location that could work? There's not a lot of money in New Orleans, let's be honest. Louisiana is one of the poorest states. There's a lot of issues in New Orleans as a metro. But it does sit between the Florida locations in the south and Texas. It does sit in that kind of area, but is the interest there from potential fans? You might get some snowbirds, but is the interest there from locals year in, year out to watch the NHL? But New Orleans has come along and had meetings with the NHL about a potential expansion team. Kansas City comes up a lot as well in regards to potential expansion. The NHL has been to Kansas before. Admittedly, not for very long in the 70s, but the NHL has been to Kansas, and Kansas City regularly comes up in regards to conversation about future expansion and or relocation. Going back to before Vegas joined the league, Kansas entered the conversation and was interested. It didn't go much further than interest, but Kansas City regularly gets mentioned on fan forums as a location. Kansas City is more likely than Omaha, but the fact that another Midwest location like Kansas, similar to Omaha, gets mentioned now is showing that there's interest in the 48 contiguous US states in some locations you wouldn't expect. Hartford, Connecticut comes up. Hartford is actually the smallest metro on the list. It's the smallest city on the list, but Hartford, Connecticut return the Whalers. Former WHA franchise, former NHL franchise, now the Carolina Hurricanes. Could Hartford make a return? Is there enough interest still in the Hartford area? There seems to be on fan forums a lot of discussion about Hartford. It's not too far from the New York Metro. There's a fair bit of disposable income in Hartford in certain segments. It's about an arena. That's what did them for the Whalers, was the lack of an arena. They were playing in a shopping mall, basically. The lack of an arena, a lack of a viable long-term arena. So that could be a sticking point. But Hartford's part of the northeast megalopolis. There's a lot of population there, a lot of money. But as far as I know, no official meetings have been had between the City of Hartford, any ownership group, and the NHL. But there's a growing call from fans to return to Hartford. Phoenix, they've been given first refusal, so they will potentially be in the next batch of expansion, or at least in future expansion, for a return of the Coyotes and or a new franchise with a new name. Arena issues have caused issues with the Phoenix Arizona team before, with the Coyotes before, between 96 and last year 2024. There are arenas already that can host NHL hockey in the Phoenix Metro. Bad ownership did for Phoenix, and the NHL has to take some blame there. But that's a massive, fast-growing metro with a big population. That's a lot of corporate. That's a lot of eyes on your product. That's a big TV audience that the NHL wants. Very similar to Atlanta. They want to go back. They've stated that Phoenix/Arizona will get a team when they restart the expansion process and or relocation. Phoenix is wanted by the NHL. Fans can disagree about the Sunbelt strategy, but look at some of these locations, like Atlanta, Houston, and Phoenix. There's a reason why the NHL wants these locations and is having meetings with these locations, and there's already been interest from groups in Phoenix about a potential return there already within 12 months of the last team relocating to Utah. Quebec City is the Canadian location that regularly turns up. I could have put Hamilton as well, but Quebec City regularly pops up. Quebecor had meetings in regards to the Vegas expansion. There was a little bit of interest when Seattle joined, but mostly around a bid before 2017 to become the 31st team. Vegas ultimately won. They had the best economic bid. They were the location that was chosen by the NHL back in 2017. Quebec City, a lot does rely on what happens economically between Canada and the US, the strength of the Canadian dollar, and the strength of the Canadian economy, which is making it highly unlikely. At some point in the future they may return, but again, much like Hartford, New Orleans, Omaha, potentially Kansas, Quebec is a smaller market, and it will cost more to have a team in Quebec. But there we go. Now, these are some of the locations that have come up quite regularly in recent years in regards to the expansion and or relocation conversation. Now, the NHL has come out, and Gary Bettman's come out and said the league is not in expansion mode right now. That hasn't mean they've not ruled it out, but they're not in expansion mode right now. The potential dilution of talent, we've seen that argument before. I think the 90s expansion, they got things a bit wrong potentially, and we saw lockouts and strikes, and we saw the game not at its best in the 90s. Even though in my formative years, that's when I grew up watching the NHL, we saw teams relocate a lot in the 90s. There was obviously this massive growth from 1990 to 2000. 9 new teams entered the league, but we saw labour unrest, relocations, and the game not scoring drop off. The game slow. It wasn't the most entertaining sport on the eye. So dilution of talent, could that potentially happen if you expand too fast, too quick? We saw that in the 90s, as I say. Will fans in these locations be interested? Not just casually, like the Four Nations. Will locals in these locations, excluding Quebec and potentially Hartford, actually be interested? We've seen how it failed in Atlanta. We've seen how it failed in Phoenix the first time round. And we saw how Hartford, Quebec, we've seen teams relocated from these locations. And it's not because of lack of fans. Let's just put that out there. More like to do arena issues and bad ownership. But we've seen some of the locations listed that I discussed. Teams exist within the NHL and be relocated. And as I say, fans turned up. It was more ownership issues, but fans did turn up. It's about getting the right ownership, the right strategy, the right growth. How much will that change the regular and postseason? What will happen to the conferences and divisions and playoffs, and how that be structured? You know, how would that impact scheduling? Could a 40-team league work? Technically, yes. It could, but then you would have to completely restructure divisions and or conferences. So either you have 2 20-team conferences, or you have 4 10-team divisions in 2 20-team conferences. really then completely changes the dynamic of the current scheduling that we have now. An 82 game schedule, you could potentially do an 80 game schedule, for example, or an 84 game schedule. There's various ways to schedule it. It might even be a shorter regular season. You might actually reduce the number of games. You might only play each other twice. And so it literally then becomes the top 16 or top 24, whatever it is, go into the playoffs. There's no perfect system to figure that out. And with more teams, you want to maximise your TV revenue and sponsorship revenue. Could that actually mean an extension of the season? Who knows? A 40-team league is manageable. I've seen various ways that much smarter people than me in regards to mathematics have calculated how to schedule a 40-game regular season, anywhere between 78 and 84 games. I've seen it done, but would that actually be feasible? So there we go. And as I say, the talk of a 40-team NHL league goes back to the 90s, early 2000s in regards to the idea of having a European division. So this idea, in theory, you can have a 40-team NHL league is not new. It's just, is it feasible, and will fans support it? Will the potential changes to divisions and conferences be what fans want? Will the talent get too diluted? I know we've got, obviously, the European invasion, as they call it. Would that also then weaken the European leagues? Is there enough talent in Europe and North America to sustain a 40-team league at the elite level? Will fans in some of these locations, like Omaha and New Orleans and Cincinnati, for example, will they turn up? Will they be interested in these locations that aren't traditional hockey locations? That's another thing. But let's leave that there. Place your thoughts in the comment section below. What do you think will happen? Do you think we have a 40-team NHL? And I'll have some more content for you guys very, very soon.